Good evening, welcome. Good evening and welcome. Yes, it's so great to see a nice audience here tonight. I got to talk to several of you in the lobby, and I know you're ready to learn. That's always the way we do it around here at the Ford. And I'm so pleased to partner. I'm Gleaves Whitney with the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. I'm so pleased to partner year in and year out with the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. You know, President Ford and the World Affairs Council go way back to the late 40s. Michael and I, in fact, were talking about this, I think, the last time we were both at this podium. And it's really extraordinary because President Ford, even when he was a congressman, knew how important, world affairs were. Americans were the soft empire, superpower in the world, and it was important that we understand how the world works and, where we can actually do really good. So it's a great partnership. We want to continue to strengthen that partnership. To do that, we need more young people in the audience. I see some here tonight. I'd like to challenge you. I've been challenging our audiences a couple of times recently. I would challenge you to bring somebody half your age into our audience, please, so that more people are exposed to the wonderful speakers that we have. I also want to say, speaking of partnerships, how much I enjoy our partnership with the host of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, Brooke Clement. Brooke, your team and our team at the foundation work so well together. I really appreciate what we're able to do together in hosting events like this with the World Affairs Council. Thank you. I think tonight's program is really apt for a number of reasons, but President Ford and things nuclear go way back, of course, starting in 1945, when you had to really worry about the proliferation of nuclear materials around the world. Would the good guys have them? Would the bad guys have them? And what would happen if more bad guys got them than we wanted at that point? And then in 1973, we had an energy crisis that I think forced a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle to think about nuclear energy. So if you go back and look at President Ford's energy policy, 1973, 74, 75, he was talking about the importance of nuclear energy to help us through an energy crisis. And then, of course, in 2005, just shortly before he passed away, Donald Rumsfeld, President Ford's former Secretary of Defense, came to the former president. He said, "I've got good news for you, exciting news. The U.S. Navy wants to name and create a whole new brand of carrier, a new class of carrier called the Gerald R. Ford." CVN 78 was born as an idea that came to fruition and launched in 2013. So President Ford wasn't alive to see that moment. But those are three iterations of the importance of nuclear power in the world today. And the Ford happens to be the largest, most massive platform on the seas as a lethal weapon out there protecting us. So this is a topic that was near and dear to President Ford's heart. And that's why it's so important to have the speaker we have tonight and to introduce him and to do many other things. Dr. Erica Kubik is Director of Programming for the World Affairs Council. Please give Dr. Kubik a hand.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces. Thanks for extending great decisions with us this year and enjoying this program with us tonight. As Gleaves said, I'm Erica Kubik, the Director of Programming for the Council, but on behalf of my colleagues Michael Van Denen, Rachel Brooks, Abigail Stead, as well as our Board of Directors, we welcome you all. We're pleased to host the Great Decisions series. I think every iteration of the series, we gush about our partnership with both the Gerald R. Ford Library and Museum as well as the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and they are our true steadfast partners in this series. We also want to thank, though, the museum staff as well as GRCC for helping us increase our impact by recording this programming and making it available to a wider audience here in West Michigan and beyond. As well, we'd like to express our appreciation to WGVU Public Media as our presenting media sponsor and to the Community Media Center as our communication partner. And then a final thanks goes to our friends at Barnes & Thornburg for making this program possible. Now let's get to the meat of it, and let me introduce our conversation leaders. So Page Stoutland is a former consultant to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, or NTI, in Washington, D.C., and he had previously served as the NTI Vice President for Scientific and Technical Affairs, which was responsible for NTI's scientific and technically related projects designed to strengthen nuclear security and reduce risks around the world. And then prior to joining NTI, Stoutland spent the previous 10 years at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where he held several senior positions, and also at the U.S. Department of Energy, where he served as the director of the Chemical and Biological National Security Program and at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Dr. Stoutland graduated from St. Olaf College in Minnesota and holds a PhD in chemistry from the University of California, Berkeley. Tonight's moderator, Brooke Clement, is the director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. She has also served in archival and supervisory roles at the George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama Presidential Libraries and Museums. Our conversation tonight is titled Nuclear Risk in a Changing World. Let's extend a warm welcome to our guests.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Glebes, for that introduction. Really appreciate it. So I am sitting in for Joel Westfall tonight, just as an FYI, but he prepared me well with some questions, so we're just gonna jump right into the questions here with Paige. First, can you discuss your role with the Nuclear Threat Initiative and what the organization does? Like, oh, there.
Now it's on.
There it is.
Well, let me step back a little bit and just talk a little bit about where I was before I got to the Nuclear Threat Initiative and then talk about that organization. I mean, as was mentioned, I'm a chemist by training. I ended up spending much of my career at our national laboratories at Los Alamos National Lab and Livermore National Laboratory, and also had the chance to serve in the government for a few years between those two laboratories. So, you know, at those laboratories, we spent a lot of time developing science and technology related to reducing risks, to better detect proliferation, to reduce the risk that a nuclear weapon might be used somewhere. But after being there for nearly 20 years, I was given the opportunity to go to a completely different kind of organization, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, or NTI as we called it. I had no idea what I was getting into. But this organization was actually created by former Senator Sam Nunn and CNN founder Ted Turner, who many of you may have noticed passed away in the last week or so. And their idea was that while reducing nuclear risks was really a primary goal of governments, that there were certain things that the private sector could do better. That they could maybe get in quicker, they could maybe be more agile, or they could do things that governments were at a sort of a gridlock and couldn't make any progress. So they were able to attract a significant amount of funding and then hired a relatively small staff. We were ultimately maybe 50 people or so. And our job was to do whatever we could to reduce nuclear, chemical, and biological risks around the world so we didn't have a catastrophe. So the organization did everything from making movies to increase awareness, to creating indices or rankings of how effectively certain countries were doing securing their materials, for example, to producing policy papers on how we deal with the cyber threat to nuclear weapons, for example. So in contrast to the government, where there were, you know, literally thousands of people working on these issues, we were 20-some people or 50-some people. And it was an exciting place to be because we were limited by our imagination, really. We had all the money we needed. All we had to do was find something that was legal to do that would actually have some effect.
Excellent. Well, and speaking of nuclear risk and movies for that matter, in 1983, a made-for-television movie exposed the dangers of nuclear weapons to a national TV audience that deeply impacted Ronald Reagan. And when he saw it, he asked those at the Pentagon, would it really happen like this? And they responded, no, sir, it would be much worse. So do we need another Day After movie to raise awareness, or the movies that are out there right now that the NTI produced, things that we should be paying attention to?
I mean, I'm fully supportive of more movies or any attempt to increase awareness, but frankly, it's really hard. NTI created some movies. Other organizations have done so. Some of you may remember that just a few years ago, there was a movie called Oppenheimer that got a lot of attention. A lot of the organizations like the Nuclear Threat Initiative tried to use that to increase awareness of what would happen and how we can reduce the risks. But it's unfortunately just very difficult to reach people in a sustained way to really make progress. And so it's essential to try to do the education, but it's just very hard, and we need more help in that area.
Okay. Do you have ideas for how we could better educate people who may not have experienced the Cold War?
Well, it's mentioned that this group, including myself, is starting to have more gray hair than we all like to admit. Where are the young people that really have the ideas and can make progress in this issue? And I will say at NTI, we had a fabulous set of young people. This is an issue that attracts people who want to be scholars in this area, but it's not enough. And so it's a continual challenge to make this area interesting enough to get folks to work in it. And it's a very difficult field to make sustained progress in. I mean, we'll talk later about what can be done to reduce the risks, but it's difficult, slow work, and some people don't want to spend 20 or 30 years of their career trying to do this when they can go work on artificial intelligence in Silicon Valley.
So when most folks think of nuclear weapons, such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those are relatively small devices, and compared to the more modern nuclear weapons, which are giant thermonuclear devices that are in the megaton range. How did we get there so quickly from 1945 to now?
Well, so let's talk a little bit about what would happen if a nuclear weapon went off and the scale of weapons, because I think it's important for us to understand what the implications really would be so that we know what we're dealing with. So as you mentioned, I mean, nuclear weapons have only been used in war twice during the World War II. Those weapons were roughly 15 kilotons, so the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. The use of those weapons killed roughly 70,000 people. And spatially, a weapon that big will sort of decimate an area of a few kilometer radius. So unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, those are small weapons. Today's weapons tend to be hundreds of kilotons or even megatons. Megaton is 1 million tons of TNT. Instead of propagating out a few kilometers, it might be tens of kilometers, depending on how the weapon is used. And the scale of devastation would be potentially in the millions of people should a weapon be used in a populated area. But I think that's just the initial prompt damage. So the challenge for us is that should a weapon be used, particularly tens of weapons or even hundreds of weapons, and maybe we'll get into who has what quantities of weapons a little bit later. But we've got other effects which are often not talked about. One of them is the economic devastation. We're seeing what happens to gas prices now when we're having a war in the Middle East. That would pale in comparison to what we're talking about with nuclear weapons. There were studies done historically in the Cold War period, and they were updated recently about what the devastation would be to the oil industry in the United States, with just a handful of weapons to take out basically all of our oil. And without oil or power, you don't have electricity, you can't pump gas, you can't cool food. And there are those who believe that we would never recover as a nation because of the devastation of the economy should there be a serious attack. Furthermore, other studies have suggested that the climate would change. You may recall that years ago people talked about nuclear winter. Well, what nuclear winter was that if a nuclear bomb goes off, it'll blow all sorts of dirt up into the atmosphere, and it gets above the stratosphere where it just circulates around the Earth, lowering temperatures such that crops don't produce as much as they should, and that there would in fact be starvation around the world depending on the degree of this. So what's noteworthy about things like nuclear winter, and I think maybe to some extent the impact on the economy, is that the use of nuclear weapons wouldn't have to occur within the United States, for example. If there was a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, and let's say 100 of their weapons were launched, leading to some sort of nuclear winter or perhaps a nuclear autumn, that would directly affect us. And so we are vested in trying to understand how to reduce the risk, not only directly to the United States, but to all others around the world, because we're all sort of in this together, if you will. So the immediate near-term effects are horrendous, potentially millions of people, but that pales in comparison to what could be the impact because of the impact on our economy or even on the climate.
Interesting. So since World War II, has the world ever been close to using a nuclear weapon?
Well, you keep bringing up these scary questions.
Hey, these were Joel's questions.
So I'll say yes. And there's a number of well-known examples that are typically accidents or what you might call miscalculations. There's a well-known one during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where a Russian or a Soviet submarine was being bombarded with depth charges, which they thought meant that the war had begun. And one of the key officers on the submarine wanted to use his nuclear torpedo. Fortunately, someone else on the submarine vetoed that, and so he did not use it. But it was literally one decision away from use of a nuclear torpedo in the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1983, to use another example, the Soviet Union thought that they were being attacked from the U.S. Their radar systems saw hundreds of weapons or missiles coming over the poles. But someone named Colonel Petrov decided to disobey the normal procedure and to not retaliate. That was not what he was supposed to do. So it literally was one decision away from the Russians retaliating because they thought they were being attacked. There have been other cases where there are technological failures, including in the United States, where we thought we were being attacked, but it was a computer chip that had malfunctioned. Fortunately as well, cooler heads prevailed and they thought there was something a little bit funny with it, so they did not decide to retaliate. But we've literally been one or two decisions away from use of a nuclear weapon, which in all likelihood would have led to uncontrolled escalation.
That is scary. So today's nuclear club, who are they? And can you give us a primer on who has nuclear weapons and the overall modern state of play?
Right. So today there are 9 countries known to have nuclear weapons: U.S., Russia, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. That's, I suppose, a bit of good news. I recall that I think it was John F. Kennedy thought that with expected levels of proliferation at this point in time, we might have 15 or 20 countries that have nuclear weapons, so maybe that's a little bit of good news. But today, in part because of what's going on in the world at large, there are other countries starting to think about either getting or rejuvenating a nuclear program. That includes Japan, that includes South Korea. Currently, it's sort of more right-wing elements in those countries, and it's not, I think, a serious near-term risk. But if they were to get weapons, that would be reversing the trend that we'd all like to see.
And then, on top of all of that, we've got AI issues, and since these weapons have been launched or developed, there's always been that fear of an accidental launch, which you were just describing. Does AI make that more or less probable? And is there a fear that AI would help hackers get into the system?
Yeah, let me take on sort of both AI as well as the cyber risk. So, the good news is that no one is seriously considering putting our weapons under the control of AI. But what I worry more about is what I might call the unintended implications of AI. So, for example, artificial intelligence is extremely good at identifying patterns. So it's being used to, look at a mole on your arm to tell if you have cancer, for example. So that's a great application. It's also used, for example, to better understand what a radar image looks like. Well, the nuclear weapons programs use radar to tell whether nuclear missiles are coming over the pole, for example. So it's entirely natural that AI would be, over time, infused into those systems, because in principle it would give a better system for detecting these missiles with lower false alarm rates. But at the current state, AI is still a quite fragile technology. And so whenever you marry a fragile technology with an incredibly high consequence application, you need to be incredibly careful. So I worry more about sort of the unintended use, where AI might be incorporated into some system with all good intentions from the engineers who designed it, but it might fail in a way that's unpredictable that could lead to whatever consequences. Cyber is another issue which we've spent a lot of time working on. The concern, of course, is that what we've come to understand, this wasn't the case maybe 10 years ago, we've come to understand that every system is vulnerable. And I'm sure, we all have our experience with people getting into our emails and whatever. But even in very sophisticated systems, it's literally impossible to design a system that's perfectly secure. So again, when you put that in a high consequence application, you need to be very concerned. And I mean, I will say that our systems are incredibly secure. People are working very hard on that. But we're not just interested in security of our systems. If the Russian systems are not secure and get hacked for whatever reason leading to the use of a nuclear weapon, we are as vested in that as if it were one of our weapons. Similarly, with artificial intelligence, for example, we may make a decision to not use AI because of its fragility, but that's not to say that Kim Jong-un is going to do the same thing in North Korea. He may want to put his systems under AI control, because then you don't have to, it sort of helps you on the retaliation, if you will. If you're decapitated, you could still have a retaliation. And so, again, what I'm starting to, I guess, talk about here is that this is not only a global problem. We're as vested in the security of countries, weapons all over the world, but the solution in turn needs to be an international solution as well. We cannot solve this problem on our own.
Yeah, and that will lead right into this next question. For decades, the Soviet Union or Russia and the United States had treaties limiting nuclear weapons in one way or other. These treaties are all now gone, and it would be nice to know where the world needs to be when it comes to limiting the weapons. Is it more treaties, or are we headed for another nuclear arms race?
Yeah. So, well, in terms of what treaties exist, I mean, I guess the good news is we still have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is sort of the foundation of all these treaties. We no longer have the primary treaty with Russia, the so-called New START Treaty. And so, well, just to sort of update this, so it used to be that this was about the United States and Russia, and we could sit down and have an agreement. That agreement has lapsed, which is unfortunate, because not only is it sort of a commitment to do something, but it provides certain levels of transparency, and it promotes discussion between the countries so that we have a better awareness of what their intentions are, and vice versa. None of those major treaties, well, none of the treaties like New START and its predecessors involved China. And that was because historically China only had 150 or 200 weapons. Over the last few years, China has increased its number of weapons to now it's, I think, around 600, and they're projected to go up to over 1,000 at some point in the future. So any future agreement needs to include not only the United States and Russia, but China as well, and maybe even other countries if possible. That said, treaties take a long time to negotiate. They're very slow, and so one would not want to depend on that uniquely. We should still pursue those efforts where we can reach formal agreements. We can and should, but we should also think about other mechanisms to, in the near term, to reduce the risk and hopefully reduce the numbers and the potential that some weapon might actually be used.
And you mentioned that there are about 15 countries that currently have nuclear weapons. Are there other countries that, well, you did mention that, never mind. We'll move on to a different question. So what can or should be done to prevent a nuclear war?
So, I mean, there's a long list. We should continue to prevent the proliferation so that more countries do not have nuclear weapons. We should try to reduce numbers where we can. In terms of what I'll call the terrorist nuclear threat, the potential that a terrorist might get nuclear material and make a crude nuclear device, we should work very hard to secure nuclear materials around the world. There's something like 30 countries that have small amounts of weapons-usable nuclear materials. We should make sure they're secure, and that was, in fact, the genesis of a project at NTI where we looked to rank how effectively countries were securing their nuclear materials. We should, I think, conduct, I mean, as difficult as it is, try to promote awareness of this issue and somehow figure out how to deal with all these geopolitical issues which are front and center these days.
So what do you worry about most with this? You know, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah. So I think it's what I would put into the miscalculation category or sort of an accident of some sort, particularly if it's occurring at a time of crisis due to something else. So for example, we're now in the midst of a war in the Middle East. There's a Ukraine-Russia war that's going on. And if it's in that context and all of a sudden somebody sees something or decides to launch a nuclear weapon, you know, or does something that looks like the launch of a nuclear weapon and someone then retaliates with an actual nuclear weapon, that's, I think, concerning. I mean, the concern that, you know, is there concern that Russia's going to, out of the blue, launch 1,000 weapons towards the United States? Probably not, right? But could there be a miscalculation where we think all of a sudden there's 1 or 2 missiles coming over, Kim Jong-un said something, or President Trump said something? I mean, it's that sort of confusion which would amplify the risk. And then related to that, I think, is the new tech side, which just compounds these issues, whether it be cyber or AI or something else.
Speaking of the Middle East, can you give us a sense about what's going on with Iran, and are they close to a bomb?
Yeah. So the primary concern is the quantity of nuclear materials that Iran is known to have. I think it's something like 400 to 500 kilograms of material at different levels of enrichment, including up to quite highly enriched material. So that exists, and I think there's a debate about how long it would take to turn that into a nuclear weapon, but it's measured in sort of months to a year time frame. The big question is intent, and whether they're doing anything other than just making the nuclear material, because the nuclear material can be used for nuclear power, which is what they're talking about. Back in the early 2000s, they were pursuing what one would call weaponization activities. From all the public reporting anyway, that appears to not have happened since the early 2000s, so nearly 20 years ago. And at the current state, apparently, most of this nuclear material is buried under the rubble. So the challenge is to sort of figure out what the path forward is, and I don't have the answer there, other than the fact that what we've done so far is not making us any friends, and their knowledge of how to make a nuclear device is not going to go away. And so I think this is not, a military solution is not the answer here. There needs to be a diplomatic solution of some sort. Many of you may know there was an agreement from several years ago called the JCPOA, which the Trump administration decided to not follow. Which then led the Iranians to enrich the material to higher levels. So it's a difficult situation.
So you mentioned the economic collapse and some bit of like the nuclear winter. Like, what could we expect beyond that in terms of a bomb being, dropped on any part of the United States, for instance?
Well, I think one thing I'll point to is, and we're seeing it now in the Strait of Hormuz, but we've seen it other places, and that's that the world is an interconnected place. Even despite the fact that some countries want to be a little more isolationist than others, fundamentally this is a global economy, and even a ship stuck in the Suez Canal, caused all sorts of problems. We've got 1,000 ships or something in the Strait of Hormuz now. We're seeing the price of gas, and of course, those are pretty small things in the scheme of things, but it's interconnected. And so even if you saw even one use of a nuclear weapon would have enormous ripple effects around the world, in addition to the life of being people being killed in the immediate blast. So I think it's hard to estimate what the impact would be. The other issue is that if one nuclear weapon is used, how do we stop the retaliation that leads to 2, that leads to 3, 4, 5, 10, what we call escalation? How do we control escalation? And that can be difficult if there may be simultaneous cyber attacks occurring, which may make it difficult for one leader to call another. So we may have a difficult time sort of de-ratcheting things. And so, clearly the solution is to do whatever we can to prevent the first use of a nuclear weapon, because it's going to get harder after the first one or the second one or the third one is used.
And so what about deterrence and all of that then?
Well, so, deterrence was sort of a longstanding policy. It worked very well between Russia and the United States. Well, I'll say it worked very well. I'll come back to that in a moment. But deterrence doesn't work against terrorists. It may not work against all countries. And so it's a technique that was maybe right for the time, but it's not robust sort of globally. But when you speak of deterrence, one of the things people will say is, well, it's been 80 years since the use of a nuclear weapon, so we're doing pretty well. Well, so that's the question: are we doing well? We've managed to avoid all accidents that have led to a nuclear detonation. We haven't used a nuclear bomb in war, so that's pretty good news. Or are we just being lucky? As might be suggested, by some of these cases, like I mentioned, the Cuban Missile Crisis and Colonel Petrov. So if we're lucky, or if we've been lucky, is our luck about to run out? Because we're now making it even harder because we've got cyber attacks and AI, and we've got geopolitical issues around the world. That's the fundamental challenge for us. And it's, in fact, one of the fundamental challenges in the nuclear community, between those that believe that deterrence has been very effective and we haven't had a nuclear use for 80 years, and those who believe that we're just lucky and we're one bad day away from a nuclear disaster.
Wow, okay. I think
that's uplifting.
Erica and Michael, I think that I'm going to turn it over to the audience here for questions, because I'm blown away as I'm just sitting here.
Yeah, let's give Dr. Stoutland and Brooke a round of applause. I already see some hands in the air, so I'll pass a microphone around, and Michael will as well when I get it to him.
Do we know, does the public know whether there are ongoing discussions between various countries, including us, at all times or never? And if so, at what level? Like, for example, our president is probably, I think, visiting Xi this week. Do they ever have discussions about this sort of thing? Or is it on a separate level where that goes on?
So by discussions in this area, you mean just talking about nuclear risks and what might be done to prevent them?
Yes.
Well, yeah, there are many discussions. And I think it depends on which countries are involved. So actually, I think either this week or last week is a review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and these issues are brought up at that UN forum, including how well we're doing on disarmament and non-proliferation and a number of things. But sort of more specifically, certainly within NATO, there are many discussions. With Russia and China, I would say at the official government level right now, there are not nearly as many as we'd like to see. That's one of the places where organizations like NTI and other non-government organizations can sort of fill in that gap. I mean, as part of my time at NTI, I went to Russia a couple times a year, and I've been to China a couple times a year, specifically for this reason, to identify things that we could do together that would reduce the risk in some way. So there are discussions going on, but given particularly the war in Ukraine, for example, that has dramatically led to fewer discussions between the United States and Russia. In fact, as an aside, I think the Ukraine war started in 2014, if I'm remembering. I was in Russia the previous year working on some specific activities that we could do together that would provide increased transparency and provide a reduced risk related to terrorist use of a nuclear weapon. This went all the way up. In fact, the Russian deputy foreign minister was involved in some of our discussions, was personally committed to this. But within the next year, then, when Russia started the Ukraine war, all of that stopped. And so it's been much less dialogue and work together than there was previously, and that's just one example.
Is there any way that individuals can protect themselves from a nuclear event now if it takes place?
Yeah, I mean, not really. I mean, sure, there are things that are potentially, but the long pole in the tent well, just take on the terrorist use of a nuclear weapon. The challenge there is to keep nuclear materials out of the hands of somebody who might make a nuclear bomb with it. And so there are global programs to do that have been quite successful. That's sort of the long pole in the tent, so to speak, preventing the use, not dealing with the consequences after the fact. Now, that said, if something happens, and you're not at the epicenter, yeah, there are things that can be done, but healthcare would be overwhelmed. I mean, it's really hard to think of things that would be robust and general and would make a big difference.
You spoke about some of the economic factors for nuclear winter, but what about changing the wobble of the Earth and the orbit? That is total destruction, isn't it not, if that were to happen?
Yeah, I don't know, I'll be honest with you. I haven't seen the work in that area. It strikes me that might be at the high end of needing to have a lot of nuclear detonations to even make that, plausible, but I really haven't looked into it.
Do you have any books that you recommend about the topic, like 1 Second After, Nuclear War by Anna Jacobson, or anything like that, that can help us understand what to expect, that it's going to take 2 to 20 years if something like this happens?
Yeah, so Jacobson's book is, I think, good in terms of highlighting what would happen. It doesn't provide a lot of solutions. There's a book called Nuclear Command and Control, which looks at an accident. I'm trying to remember who. Eric Schlosser is the author. It's a great book to sort of sensitize you to how close we have come to accidents, leading to nuclear detonations. So those are two that are recommended, and I should have more than that on the tip of my tongue, but those are two good ones to get started with.
Now, has technology also evolved to where we can monitor nano amounts of nuclear material that's being moved throughout the world?
So I don't think we can monitor nano amounts, but I'm glad you brought that up because I've focused primarily on some of the bad things that happen with technology. There's a lot of good stuff going on with technology as well. So for example, we have satellites circling the Earth, which are basically able to photograph every inch of the Earth on sort of a daily, if not more frequent basis. So that's really important when it comes to, for example, seeing what the Iranians might or might not be doing from a remote platform. So sort of the general category of proliferation detection technologies has really improved, and that's, that's great news when it comes to keeping proliferators at bay.
Okay, you didn't mention anything about radioactive fallout with these bombs.
I didn't, and I should have. That's another, in some cases, near-term impact. Other cases, it might happen over decades, sort of smaller doses.
In Iran, the JOP, the joint agreement was signed in Iran back a while. When that was done, in your opinion, had they given up the idea of producing a nuclear weapon? Because it was on page 3.
So, I mean, my understanding, and my boss helped to negotiate that deal, was that they believed, well, they wanted to keep the quantities of nuclear material down, and they wanted some predictability that would go out years. The agreement was criticized for not addressing the long term. And that was one of the things that led to the Trump administration getting out of it. My understanding, though, is that there is no, I mean, it's difficult to ascertain their intent, clearly, and then I think a lot of this hinges on that. But my understanding is that there's no evidence since the early 2000s that they're pursuing any other weaponization activities. And so I think that's, well, then the question is how quickly they could restart that should they choose to, and that's where people disagree, I think. I can hear you, yeah.
So following up on that, do you have some vision or idea of what a solution for the Iran situation could be right now?
Do you want to repeat that question?
Yeah.
The question is what my solution is for the Iran situation.
Or even a possible solution.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to. There's so many really smart people working on this that, I mean, and I don't focus on Iran. But I think, I mean, what I said earlier is that a military solution is not ever going to solve this problem. It needs to be a political situation. Agreements clearly needs to take on the quantities of enriched uranium. To the extent it can stop them from enriching uranium for some period of time, that's good, and the longer the better. On the other hand, enriching uranium is not illegal. It is allowed around the world for nuclear energy purposes. And so I think there has to be some recognition that they, if they want, can have a nuclear energy program. Now, there are various models where they would not enrich uranium themselves, they'd get it from someone else and so on. But this is a political problem, and whatever the right range of incentives is to get them to not produce a nuclear weapon. I mean, unfortunately, I think a lot of what we're doing right now is going in the opposite direction, right? I mean, what we're showing, unfortunately, for one more time, is that if you have a nuclear weapon, you don't get invaded. But if you do have, if you don't have a nuclear weapon, we may invade you, as we did in Iraq and Venezuela and so on. So I just, I worry we're giving the wrong signals.
On that political note, I actually have a related question. So you've talked about how President Ford and also the role of Senator Nunn in these affairs. And from the policy side, I'm trying to better understand how orgs like NTI focus on building like a durable political constituency when the issue is like measured in things not happening. So I guess kind of just with your background, I was curious if you could talk about how policymakers with respect to Capitol Hill, because I know that's another key pivotal role in these international negotiations, less so with nuclear, but how, if there are any policymakers that are doing that translation well to the public in terms of clearly articulating the rationales and reasons why this is necessary work. And yeah, just any particular offices you see doing that work well.
Yeah, I mean, at a specific level, I don't follow sort of all the goings on Capitol Hill. But just let me make a general statement. You know, back when Senator Nunn, for example, was in office, there were many sort of serious thinkers who were working on this problem and related problems. Many of those people are gone, right? You know, there aren't policy experts, with maybe a handful, very small number of exceptions, that work on these issues. And that's part of the, and you hate to just keep bringing up problems, but that's one of our major problems. You know, the days of having Kissinger and Nunn and Lugar and all these luminaries around, unfortunately aren't there. I mean, they made some risky but really impactful decisions back in the 90s, right? They made a decision that we would help Russia secure their nuclear weapons so they didn't get loose on the market and get used by some terrorists. The idea of the US and the Soviet Union, or now Russia, cooperating on these things was unheard of at the time. And yet they made a tough decision to do that. And so we need more decisions like that, more people thinking about this if we're going to prevent, you know, the next catastrophe.
Thank you so much for your presentation so far. I'm way over here.
Okay.
I have a two-pronged question. For this audience, we are not scientists in the majority here, can you give us some delineation between what would be a parameter for setting up a good energy program countrywide, and what over that level would be working towards a bomb of some sort?
You're talking about the enrichment level in uranium?
Right, the enrichment level.
Right.
So how do we distinguish if a country is going too far?
Right. So a general idea is that the enrichment level for a nuclear power program is around 4% uranium-235. So-called bomb-grade uranium is around 90% uranium-235. Now, between them, it's officially considered highly enriched uranium if it's over 20% uranium-235, because in principle, you could make a very crude bomb out of that material. But the higher it gets, the more, you know, dangerous it is or more effective your bomb would be. Is that answering your question?
Thank you very much. The other part of my question is going in a different direction towards solutions. I'm wondering if anybody is working in the United Nations or NATO to have a consortium of all the countries to discuss how to do exactly the work you've been doing.
So probably the closest that comes to that is the UN and their meetings around the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which looks at whether or not proliferation is happening, whether or not disarmament is happening, and so on. But there's been, amongst many countries, sort of dissatisfaction over the years at the level of disarmament that's happening. So despite the fact that back in the height of the Cold War, there were some 60,000 nuclear weapons in the world, if I recall, and now we're down to maybe 10 or 12,000 weapons. So that's sort of good news, but on the other hand, why do we need 12,000 weapons, right? So many countries that do not have nuclear weapons were very frustrated at the very slow progress that's happening in that area, including in the United States and Russia and elsewhere. So they actually created a new treaty called the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which actually entered into force, I think it was last year or the year before, without the signature of the United States and Russia and China. So there are those who are trying to make progress, and yet those with nuclear weapons, including the United States, believe that we need all the weapons we have, and we couldn't do, you know, well with a few fewer.
Just to share a personal detail, I taught the book Hiroshima to community college students for about 15 years as an English teacher. And if about fallout, that's probably the best book I know. I want to ask about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, because I don't understand how it came about and whether it works at all, since signatories then go on to develop nuclear armaments.
Well, let's see. I'm not the person to give you a history lesson on this, but it was in the 1960s. It was signed, I believe, in 1968. Those countries that had nuclear weapons at the time, which included Russia, China, the United States, France, and the UK, were sort of grandfathered in as the countries for which it would be okay to have nuclear weapons. And then all the others were expected to not have nuclear weapons. So since that time, India and Pakistan have gone on to have nuclear weapons. They're not in the treaty. Israel has nuclear weapons, but has never admitted they have nuclear weapons, so somehow they avoid this. And North Korea withdrew from the treaty so they could have nuclear weapons. So there are many faults with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it's the only thing we have. And every few years, they have a review conference and they get together and they talk about progress and they start to think about what they could do that would be meaningful. So and that includes at least talking about these issues and recognizing that, what the impact would be. And there are joint things we can work on. Nobody's interested in a terrorist use of a nuclear weapon. Nobody's interested in a nuclear winter. There are things that we can sort of all agree on, and those are sort of nipping around the edges, if you will. But fundamentally, it's, we'd like to do much better, but this is where we are.
Hi. You know that in the 1950s and the 1990s, they were doing some nuclear testing in the area of Nevada and all of that. And we know that there were some secondary effects to the people living around the area, like giving them cancer or,
Sorry, which area?
My name is Cristel, but my question is, do you know if there are any nuclear testing places that we don't know?
Oh. Well, if we don't know, then I don't know. But,
no, yeah, but
maybe what you're referring to is that, there was many years ago testing in the atmosphere, not underground. It affected a number of the South Pacific islands, and a number of those inhabitants of those islands over time have come to develop various cancers and so on. And that is still a topic of discussion, but to be honest, I don't know enough about the details to know how much progress they're making on that. Other than that, it's, atmospheric testing, the good news is we no longer have atmospheric testing, thank God, because it was not consequence-free.
Paige, is there conversation about space, the new frontier? So this topic we're talking about tonight, how is it carried on when you talk about space?
Right. So there is a space treaty that touches on this, that prohibits use of nuclear weapons in space. But it is clearly a topic of a lot of interest these days. I have not focused much on it myself, but we're sort of already using space as it relates to early warning systems, communication, and so on. So it's a topic of, well, let me make one more point. There are questions related to how we use space for conventional uses, conventional military uses, as well as for nuclear uses. And there are particular satellites that support both a nuclear mission and a conventional mission. And that's a place actually where there's a little concern, because during wartime, you might choose to take out that satellite to prevent satellite communications, but all of a sudden it has a nuclear impact. And so those who are thinking about the nuclear infrastructure just would recognize that they just lost a valuable thing, and what does that mean in terms of, the next steps of some adversary. So it's already part of the discussion, if you will, but it's going to be much more prevalent in the future than it has been in the past.
I don't need it. Just a question.
Well, I don't know what they know that I don't know. But your general question is, why haven't we seen a dirty bomb? I don't know is a short answer. You know, people like myself have thought a lot about the implications over the years. It turns out it's pretty hard to do, for example, because if you get to get a really hot radioactive source, you have to do so in a way that you're not going to be personally injured when you're finding it or stealing it or whatever. It's also hard to make it disperse in a way that really makes a difference. But it's still surprising that it hasn't been tried by somebody, even though it may not have as great of an effect. And I don't know. I mean, it gets at the mindset of terrorists and what their capabilities are and what they choose to do.
Do they think, is there stuff out there that they know about that's in the wrong hands?
Good question. So I'm aware of a lot of work on what we call nuclear smuggling or countering nuclear smuggling. And the idea is that you steal some source and smuggle it across a border, maybe from the former Soviet Union or something. And there's actually a big database of how many of these incidents there have been. There have been very, very few incidents involving uranium and plutonium. Not zero, but there have been few. And I don't know if that points to sort of the security of these materials or whether our detection systems are just not very good to pick them up. But it is something people worry about. And coming back to where I started, at the national laboratories, there are pretty extensive programs in what's called nuclear forensics, where should you get a nuclear material that you've, for example, caught at a border crossing, you'd be able to analyze that and get a good sense as to where it might actually have come from, so you can then stop the leak.
That was my question.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, that was your question? Okay.
Out of curiosity, how much uranium is mined in the United States and how much is imported? And could you also talk a little bit about disposal?
Yeah, so you've raised two topics I know very little about. I have no idea how much uranium is in the U.S., but I'm sure it's easily findable. I just don't know. I don't think it's very much. I think we get a lot of it from Australia, and we actually, because we've gotten rid of a lot of our nuclear weapons over the years. They actually took the highly enriched uranium and downblended it to lower levels of enrichment so it could be used in nuclear power plants. And all that means that we didn't have to dig up more uranium. We just reused the uranium in bombs. And your second question, I forget what it was, but I also know I didn't know the answer.
She asked about disposal.
Oh, yeah, I don't know anything about that.
Oh, he's. Could you pass the mic back? No, right behind you.
I don't need this. Okay. This is maybe the dumb question of the evening. So there's been so many uses of drones in this war in the Middle East. How small can a nuclear weapon be to be transported on a drone?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So, I mean, it's public knowledge. Back in the day, we made bombs that would go in briefcases, right? So it could be that small. But maybe what's more relevant is how big could a crude nuclear weapon be? So, for example, take Iran. Let's say it has enough nuclear material and it can come up with a crude design. Maybe they're not able to miniaturize it so it would go on missiles, which is the big challenge. But could it be small enough to go on a drone? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, crude weapons are bigger, quite a bit bigger. But I hope somebody's doing that analysis, because that's actually the exact question to ask, because they're not going to be able to put something on a missile initially. But could it be carried in a car across the border? Could it be carried in a truck? Maybe even a drone? Would they put it in a drone, given that the chances are high that a lot of them would be shot down, or would they choose some other technique? But those are good questions.
I'm really afraid. Who would I ask without them coming after me?
Yeah, well, you can find out what the carrying capacity of a drone is. But then the weapons, I mean, well, that's what the national labs are doing. You know, they'll look and say, well, let's say they could make a weapon out of 20% enriched uranium. What would it weigh? They're able to do those kind of calculations.
Just so everybody knows, I'm not planning anything.
Any more? Any other questions?
Right over here.
Hi there. I was wondering if you would talk about, I know he'd mentioned it earlier as you were talking about other cases, but the South African case in terms of states where the risk has been reduced.
Yeah, I mean, it's a relatively short story. They gave up their nuclear weapons program in, what, 74, something like that? Big success.
Is there a potential application, or is that like a one-off? I guess that would be my real question.
That's a good question. I don't know enough about the history to know, but I gotta believe that all these things are unique, because the motivations for countries to have nuclear weapons are somewhat unique, right? And they're all doing a cost-benefit analysis. You know, we've probably done that most recently in the North Korean case. You know, what would it take to get North Korea to give up their weapon? And I think we tend to think, well, economically, we're going to go in and build resorts in North Korea or something, and surely that'll convince them. But then we see these cases where, well, if you have nuclear weapons, that's sort of to a certain level guarantees your security. So are you willing to give that up for anything? And the answer so far, or at least recently, is no. That's not to say we shouldn't keep trying, but.
Just one quick question. Knowing what you know, being as educated as you are on this topic, what do you do to help you sleep at night? How do you compartmentalize? What gives you hope? Because I would imagine that, you know, it could get heavy. So I'm just curious, like, you know, what do you do that helps you maintain some semblance of peace in all of this?
I'm a good sleeper. But you raise a really serious question. You know, I'm struck by the commitment of the people I know in this field who work decades to try to make this even just a little bit better. Or take Ted Turner, who we all read about last week, who did so many amazing things. And I've spent a lot of time with Ted Turner, and you know, he's pretty crazy most of the time. And 9 out of 10 of his ideas are just insane, but every now and then he's got a good one. And he was so committed. You know, he provided a lot of money to the Nuclear Threat Initiative over the years. And you just got to admire how committed someone is. I remember he came up with some idea where we were going to buy all the weapons from other people, you know, which if we could do that, might have been pretty good. But anyway, I know others who've spent 30, 40 years of their career, and I just, you know, I really admire those people. But yeah, somehow you've got to take pride in the small steps that you made. I mean, just maybe a personal story. One of the things I did at the Nuclear Threat Initiative was to create a ranking or an index of countries with nuclear materials and how effectively they secured them. We did this in partnership with the Economist Intelligence Unit. And we released this, and some countries were at the top. They were doing everything they could in terms of regulations and rules and all this, and others were way at the bottom. And after we released this, we had countries come to us and say, well, what specifically can I, from country XYZ, do to get a better ranking and have better nuclear material security? Because we all were telling everyone to have better security, but we didn't tell them what that meant. You know, and so we had to break that down into, well, you should be a part of this treaty and that treaty, and you should have this regulation, and you should keep your levels of corruption low, and so on and so forth. So once we gave them a bit of a formula, they were happy to do it. And that, you know, those are small steps, but they're meaningful.
Well, I don't know if we're going to all sleep better tonight, but we sure want to thank Page for lending us his wisdom this evening. Brooke, thank you too for moderating. Appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. We've had a great series here at the Ford Presidential Museum. Thanks to Brooke and her team, to Gleaves and his team. We'll be back again next February, right, Erica? And we'll be back for great decisions. But please stay tuned to worldmichigan.org for the other events that we'll be doing throughout the summer and throughout the fall. And our YouTube channel will, once Paige gets a look at this and make sure that he's willing to let some of these comments go out into the universe, we'll put this on our YouTube channel. So if there's somebody that you think should see this and should take all this learning in, then you can point them to that World Michigan at the YouTube channels. Thank you all for coming. Have a great night.